everyone. This is the Positive Partnership Sensory Processing webinar. It's actually a recording, so there's no participants that will be part of the webinar. So what I'm going to do is, if there's a question or time for reflection, I'm going to pause to give you some time at home to think about what was said. So my name is Suzanne Donnelly, and I'm the National Projects Officer for Positive Partnerships. I'm based in Sydney. I come from an education background, and I've taught at a school for children with autism for the past 10 years. On the slide now is just some learning outcomes. This is what we're going to cover in today's webinar. But before we start, I just wanted to read out a quote from Temple Grandin. Now, Temple Grandin is an adult with autism. She's very intelligent and has an interest in cattle and has developed a lot of engineering cattle chutes. And this is just a quote from her. "I pulled away when people tried to hug me because being touched sent an overwhelming tidal wave of stimulation through my body. I wanted to feel the comforting feeling of being held, but then when somebody held me, the effect on my nervous system was overwhelming. Small itches and scratches that most people ignored were torture. A scratchy petticoat was like sandpaper rubbing my skin raw. Hair washing was also awful. When mother scrubbed my hair, my scalp hurt. I also had problems with adapting to new types of clothes. It took several days for me to stop feeling a new type of clothing on my body. Whereas a normal person adapts to the change from pants to a dress in 5 minutes. New underwear causes great discomfort, and I have to wash it before I can wear it. I also like long pants because I dislike the feeling of my legs touching each other." So I just wanted to start with that quote, because one of the biggest and least understood challenges for people supporting those with autism can be identifying and supporting an individual's sensory need. Individuals with autism are constantly challenged to grapple with the sensory information that bombards them. Due to neurological differences that lead to behaviour associated with autism, individuals with an autism spectrum disorder may have difficulty perceiving, integrating and using sensory information accurately. These difficulties lead to the development of compensatory strategies that may not always be the most appropriate response. What we're going to start with is just looking at the diversity of autism. Now, down the left-hand side, you can see the different characteristics that are associated with autism. And then you see a sliding scale along the right, because each person with autism is very unique. And there can be a whole spectrum and range to how people with autism present. So when we talk about autism, we always consider communication, social interaction, repetitive behaviours, restricted interests, sensory processing, learning style. Also, people with autism can have a range of abilities when it comes to intellectual ability. To begin to understand the complexity of autism, we recognise that each of these characteristics will present differently in every child. These differences can vary depending on their age, health, emotional state and environment. Now, in May 2013, the DSM-5 was released, and sensory processing has now been included under the restricted patterns of behaviour, interests and activities domain. I want to give you a minute to think about the two questions on the slide. So it's important to remember that effective sensory processing forms the basis of understanding the world we live in. Understanding the sensory world impacts on the development of cognition, language, motor skills, self-care skills, as well as social and emotional development. The sensory processing is the way we take in information from our senses and how our brain and nervous system interprets this information and uses it. And the role it plays is to help keep us safe and to help us learn. When we talk about sensory processing, it's also important to think about stress. Think about when you have a migraine. Lights seem a little bit brighter, sounds louder. Sensory processing and stress is cyclical. Stress impacts on the child's ability to regulate the sensory system, and sensory changes can impact on our stress levels. So it's cyclical. When we talk about sensory processing, we also need to talk about behaviour. So stereotypic behaviour can be referred to as self-stimulatory behaviour, which is defined as a repetitious motor or posturing behaviour that have no apparent function effects on the environment. Sometimes it's known as STIMs. This type of behaviour typically comes more pronounced in children with autism between 2 to 5 years of age. Ritualistic behaviours include not only stereotypic and self-stimulatory behaviours, but may also involve adherence to rigid routines such as eating the same foods, lining up objects, and insisting on holding an object in each hand. These behaviours are more often seen in students with autism who also have a cognitive impairment, whereas realistic behaviours are more often seen in those with normal intelligence. In the past, this behaviour was viewed as problematic and was something to be eliminated. However, attempts to do so resulted in the emergence of another undesirable behaviour. It is now well recognised that stereotypies, self-stimulatory behaviours and rituals serve important functions and should not be modified without first being analysed to determine what they indicate about an individual's environment. Stimulation is essential for survival. STIMs can result in an optimal level of arousal as well as a reduction in stress. So things like hand flapping, moving fingers in front of the eyes rapidly, making a humming noise are examples of STIMs. And these can actually be helping a child's level of arousal and help them to be in a place where they can learn. So as I mentioned before, when we talk about sensory processing, we also need to talk about behaviour. Many challenging behaviours are a child's way of communicating a sensory issue or need. At times, it can be difficult to identify whether a behaviour is occurring to meet a sensory need or to achieve a different outcome, for example, requesting an activity. Sometimes the same behaviour is communicating more than one function. It is important to be a detective in order to identify the possible functions of a behaviour. If you do want to know more about behaviour, there is a recording on the Understanding Behaviour webinar. There's also information on our webpage and an online module on understanding behaviour that you can access through our webpage. So we talked about stress, and there are many factors that contribute to the stress levels of children with autism. And they include, but are not limited to, issues with sensory processing. Children with autism who receive unreliable or overwhelming information from their sensory system can be highly stressed. When their sensory systems are running on high, they'll find it more difficult to complete tasks and to make the same choices about behaviours that they can make when they are calm. As well as stress, we need to also look at daily living skills. Many of the activities of daily living, such as eating, sleeping, toileting, bathing, hair brushing, teeth brushing, are experiences that involve multi-sensory processing and it can be difficult for children with autism depending on the sensory processing. For example, a child who doesn't like touch might dislike showers or having their scalp touched. They might dislike the feeling of the toothbrush in the mouth or the smell of the toothpaste if they are sensitive to smell. Could also be soaps, deodorants, the noise in public toilets. So while difficulty with these daily living skills could be related to other aspects. of the task, such as the degree of independence, it can be helpful to reflect on the sensory requirements of that task and compare it with the child's sensory profile. And we're going to look at sensory profiles a bit later in this webinar. As well as stress and daily living skills, we also need to look at school participation and success. Sensory processing issues faced by many children with autism make many aspects of school life difficult. The school day is filled with activities and experiences that require efficient processing of information from the senses. For example, changing routines, group learning, noisy environments like assembly, activities that require multitasking. Many children with autism will withdraw from or become overloaded by the learning activities and social situations due to their sensory sensitivities. And we're going to look at sensory overload a bit later as well. Some children, the sensory environment can have an ongoing effect on them over the course of the school day, often resulting in afternoon or after-school meltdowns. Some sensory-seeking behaviours can lead to problems establishing and maintaining social relationships. For example, a child who smells their peers' hair or rubs the stockings of their teachers. And as well as school life, sensory processing can also impact on family life. The sensory needs and preferences of a child with autism can have a significant impact on the home and social life of their family. Some families avoid situations at home, for example, vacuuming, eating certain foods, and in the community, like public toilets, going to the shops, that involve sensory situations that might be overwhelming to the child. The sensory behaviours of a child may also mean that families avoid having visitors to the home. For example, if the child has a tendency to run around the house naked. Some families also have to deal with the stress that results from a sensory overloaded day at school, and need to curtail family extracurricular activities in order to provide downtime and an environment with reduced expectations in the afternoon and evening. So as well as looking at sensory processing, we're also going to look a little bit about behaviour, because for those things that were just mentioned, sensory processing can have an effect on a child's behaviour. But just want to start with talking about the 7 senses. Now you might be thinking 7, I only know 5. So generally at school we learn about our 5 senses that you can see on the screen. And these senses are called our FAR senses because we get the information from outside our body, from the environment. We're also going to look at our near senses, which are just coming up now. And these are proprioception and vestibular. And these senses get information from inside our body. So I'm just going to go quickly through a definition of these 7 senses. So we'll start with touch. So touch is also called the tactile system. And this information comes from our skin and the inside of the mouth. Actually, touch is a far and a near sense because it gets information from outside the body but also within the body. So there are also some touch receptors on other areas inside the body and the rectum. Touch receptors are not evenly spaced over the skin. In some areas, such as the fingertips, soles of the feet, lips and genitals, provide more touch information than other parts of the body. Pain and temperature are also carried by this system, and registration of these is important in protecting us from harm. So the next sense there is hearing. So hearing is also called the auditory system. And this sense involves the ears and allows for accurate interpretation of speech and environmental sounds. It helps us determine the pitch and volume of a sound and to locate the source of the sound. Next we have vision. This sense enables us to make sense of what is seen. The eyes is stimulated by light and provides information about objects, people, distance, and helps us determine our position in space. It is used to confirm all other sensory input. So next we have taste. Lovely picture there of the tongue sticking out. Okay. So taste, also referred to as the gustatory system sense, this information is received via the tongue. It provides information about different types of taste, including sweet, sour, bitter, spicy and salty. It is closely associated with smell and helps us in determining whether an item is safe to eat. And then we have smell, also called the olfactory sense. Smell is the information received via the chemical receptors in the nose. It is closely related to taste and helps alert us to smells that could be dangerous. Smells are often closely linked to experiences, either negative or positive. And then we have our two near senses, which you may have not heard of before. Some of you may have. So we've got proprioception, which is often called our internal eyes. Proprioception provides us with information about where our body is, how it is connected, and what it is doing. The information comes from all the muscles and the joints, giving us information about the position of our body, how we are moving, and where we are moving in the space around us. This sense provides us with a body schema which allows for accurate motor planning, so the blueprint for movement. And then we have vestibular. So this sensory system supplies us with information about balance and about how fast or slow our body is moving or responding to movement. Vestibular information comes from the inner ear, specifically the semicircular canals, which are stimulated when a person moves their head. The vestibular system is also sometimes called the unifying system because it provides the foundation for the effective processing of the other senses. So together, proprioception and vestibular processing are known as the movement senses, and both are important for motor planning. Okay, so when we think about our seven senses, and these are, when we talk about sensory processing, we're talking about the information gathered from these seven senses and how we use that information. We can talk about different levels of sensitivity in each of these senses. So the first one we're going to look at is hyposensitive. So a child with autism may demonstrate hypo or hypersensitivity to a greater degree, or their ability to compensate for the sensory processing differences may be limited due to the impact of other characteristics of autism. So if you're hyposensitive, you're undersensitive. Your body is not getting enough information from their senses. So often we talk about our senses being dampened or turned down. So when a child is undersensitive to sensory information, it takes a lot of extra information for the child to detect the sensory input. They may not register things that others notice. They may need extra input to notice sensory inputs. They may underreact to stimuli and end up in dangerous situations. Or they may actively seek extra sensory input from that sense. Or they may crave input from their senses that others would find nauseating or overwhelming. So you can see our two little pictures there of low registration and sensory seeking. So the opposite to hyposensitive is hypersensitive. So alternatively, a child may be hypersensitive, which is oversensitive to sensory information, and may get more information than is required for registration and processing, and they may not be able to screen out irrelevant information. So we often talk about this hypersensitive, we often talk about senses being heightened or turned up, so they're getting too much information. So as a result of this, the child may respond in an unusual way to sensory information. Some examples of how a child may respond to having turned up senses are they may notice things that others don't, they may be bothered by things others aren't, they may have a dramatic reaction to a low-level sensory input, they may avoid particular sensory information or situations where it is usually present, or they may also create other sensory input to block out or mask the sensory input that is too intense. When we talk about sensory processing, we often use this slide. And it's like if you think about a stereo system and the dials to turn up and turn down, like an equilibrium. So you can see that we've got our 7 senses, and then we've got at one end hypersensitive, which can also be referred to as turned up, oversensitive, heightened, and at the other end we have hyposensitive, which could be turned down, undersensitive, dampened. So all people have unique sensory preferences. The sensory profile of a child with autism will also be individual. A child may experience difficulties with each of the senses to differ in degrees. Children with autism are likely to have a unique mix of heightened and dampened senses. Sensitivity may vary from day to day and sense to sense, making the processing of consistent, reliable sensory messages more difficult. It seems that for many children with autism, the degree of sensitivity, for example, whether a sense is turned up or turned down, varies from moment to moment and fluctuates considerably depending on the child's level of stress. It could also depend on the situation and the environment. This next slide is just an example of a sensory profile. The sensory profile of a child can make it more difficult to maintain the optimum level of alertness in order to attend to what is relevant and to stay focused. It may also impact on what the child is paying attention to in a particular environment or situation, and therefore what they are learning or how they are storing information. As such, children with autism often require much more energy and effort to cope in sensory environments and activities that others deal with easily. For example, the classroom, assembly, supermarkets, bathrooms, playgrounds. So I'm going to show you in a video in a minute of an example of a sensory overload, which can also be called a sensory shutdown. But first I just want to talk a little bit about what is a sensory overload. So a sensory overload happens when there is too much information coming in at once, and this is overwhelming for the person. Difficulties filtering out irrelevant sensory information can make it worse. When experiencing sensory overload, a person may find it even more difficult than usual to filter out irrelevant sensory information, like the feeling of the underwear or a ticking clock in the classroom. Children prone to sensory overload often learn to control their environment or avoid overwhelming situations. Other individuals require adult support to know what causes them to overload and prevent situations from happening, and to help them to manage it when it occurs. When overloaded, a child may withdraw or use a behaviour that results in them being removed from the problematic environment. You can see this a lot in class when a child reacts in a way to a sensory stimulation, knowing that they will get sent out of the classroom, and that's often what they're wanting. So the child may also engage in a repetitive or ritualistic behaviour that helps to screen out some of the source of the overload and provide consistent and reliable sensory information that is calming, for example, flapping. It is also possible for a child to go into sensory shutdown, where they block out sensory information coming from one or more of the senses. And this is why we talked about stress a little bit earlier, because it's vital to recognise the link between sensory processing and stress. Hypersensitivity, so that's when you're oversensitive to sensory information, can result in children becoming highly aroused and overstimulated by their senses. And these children can become highly stressed in the presence of such stimuli. The reverse effect is also true. In times of stress, the nervous system is already stimulated, so a person can become even more sensitive to information through their senses, which can add further to their stress levels. We have all at some time experienced extreme irritation at a tap dripping, a dog barking, or a door slamming when we are stressed. This is because our system is already on alert and our senses are heightened. Hypersensitivity to sensory information can also contribute to stress. For example, children who are hypersensitive to sound may become stressed as a result of the fact that they fail to hear vital information, or because they have missed the the subtler sensory information that provides warning of an intense stimuli. For example, a child doesn't hear the teacher approaching and calling their name until the teacher is standing right next to them. So what I'm going to do now is go to the video. It may take a little while to come up on the screen, so just be patient. Okay, so that video just gave an example of sensory overload and can be found on YouTube. So on this slide is our planning matrix. If you've been to a website, you'll be familiar with it. If you haven't been to, one of our workshops, you'll be familiar with it. If you haven't been to one of our workshops, there is information on our website about the planning matrix, and you can also print off a blank one. So if you have been to a workshop, you'll be familiar with the way the matrix is used. It's a planning tool that's used to capture a snapshot of the child. So you can see there's a column called sensory processing. So I'm just going to go through some slides now that have some different characteristics for the different senses. If you have a matrix available, then you can start inputting some of this information onto your matrix. Okay, so the first slide has touch, and you can see that on the left you've got your hypersensitive, and on your right the hyposensitive. So remembering hyper is getting too much information and hyper is not getting enough. So I'm just going to leave this slide up for a little while just for you to have a quick look at it. But it's just a list, it's not exhaustive of some of the different characteristics. And then we've got the same for hearing. There's some different examples of being oversensitive to hearing, to different sounds, and undersensitive. And vision. A person whose sense of vision is turned up might avoid eye contact. They may flap to screen out excessive vision, and someone who is turned down might have difficulty copying from the blackboard, or may attach objects to get extra information to compensate for difficulties. So taste. So with taste, with hypersensitive, you can see some of the difficulties there with things like daily living skills, with the dislike of the toothpaste and the cleaning teeth. And with the turn down, example might be to may chew on clothing and tools and pens to try to get that extra information to the taste sense. We've got smell. So if they're hypersensitive, they may be nauseated by cooking smells or bathroom smells. If they're hypo, they might not notice noxious odours, which could affect their safety. And then there's proprioceptive. If proprioceptive sense is heightened, they might bump into things. If it's dampened, they might fidget a lot, trying to get that extra information through their muscles and joints. And then vestibular, so your balance. If you're oversensitive, you might dislike being tipped upside down, might not like swings. If you're undersensitive, you might be unaware of pain and temperature. So they're just some different characteristics for each of those 7 senses, and characteristics of being both hypersensitive and hyposensitive. Okay, the next page has what we call an ABC chart. So A stands for antecedent, B behaviour, C consequent, and this is a tool that can be used when you're trying to work out the function of a behaviour. So if we're trying to determine whether the function is sensory in nature, we can use this tool. So first we'll look at the behaviour. So what does the behaviour look like? So it might be covering hands with ears, and then we look at the antecedent, so what happens before the behaviour, and it might be that the bell rings. And then C, look at the consequence, what happens after this behaviour. So it might be that the bell rings, the boy covers his hands with his ear. Maybe we'll just extend on that behaviour. Maybe he screams and runs out of the room, and the consequence is that he gets sent to the nice, quiet principal's office. So in that case, the function of the behaviour would be sensory. B could have it that a different example of behaviour might be that the boy, what happens before the behaviour is he's given a spelling list to copy. The behaviour is that he screams, run out of the room. The consequence could be that he once again gets sent to the principal's office, but in that case the reason for the behaviour is not sensory, but could be related to the work and being too difficult and not understanding what he needs to do. So this is just one tool to work out what the purpose of the behaviour could be, whether it's got a sensory purpose behind it or whether it's got another purpose. And if you do want more information on understanding behaviour, then do look at the webinar Understanding Behaviour. But another tool that webinar looks at is a most likely, least likely chart, and this chart can also be downloaded from the website. And as well as identifying when the behaviour happens and the conditions around it, but could also identify a good teaching time. So that least likely spot is the time when we want to teach a new behaviour. And why we talk about behaviour when we're talking about sensory processing is because research shows that these are the reasons behind a behaviour. When we're coming to understand a behaviour, we really need to understand the reason behind it. So Could be to get attention or get an object or activity. But you can see there it could be to get a sensory need met. So for someone who is smelling someone's hair to get that sensory input. Or it could be to get away from attention, to get away from object activity, or once again there to get away from a sensory need. So it's important to understand sensory processing and also understand how it can have effect on behaviour. Okay, so I'm just going to talk quickly around strategies. And you can see in the bottom of the matrix there is the strategies. And when we talk about strategies, we really need to link them to the impact and make sure they're addressing the impact of the characteristics. So it's important to begin that to acknowledge that sensory processing differences only need to be addressed if they're having a negative impact on the child, resulting in challenging behaviour, or if they're restricting the child's ability to participate in activities at home, school, or in the community. So addressing sensory issues in these instances involves having a clear picture of the child's sensory profile and an understanding of the impact of the sensory environment, activity, routines, their ability to participate. By looking at these two aspects, so the profile and the environment, one can identify any mismatch and consider how to minimise the impact of the child's sensory profile on their ability to cope at home, school, and in the community. When there is a mismatch between the child's sensory profile and the environmental task, it is then possible to adjust the environmental task or teach the child, or teach the child how to cope more effectively with that situation or activity, or to access their sensory needs in another, more appropriate way. Incredibly valuable to spend time observing your child's behaviour and using some of those tools that were just shown and looking at how they respond to sensory information in order to understand their sensory system, how their sensory system works. An occupational therapist can also assist you in identifying your child's sensory profile and suggesting strategies that may assist. People supporting individuals with sensory challenges should conduct an environmental analysis to identify conditions that may be causing the behaviour or maybe shaping some stims so that the student's sensory needs are met in a more socially acceptable manner. So as you can see there, that was just the slide, much more easier version of what I just said. So you need to understand a child's unique sensory profile and determine the impacts on the child in all environment. So minimising the impact of sensory issues involves considering the mismatch between the child's sensory profile and the sensory environment in which the child is expected to participate. Sensory processing difficulties impact on a child's ability to learn and behave appropriately at home, school, and in the community. So with school, the sensory processing issues faced by many children with autism make many aspects of school life difficult. The school day is filled with activities and experiences that require efficient processing of information from the senses. For example, those constantly changing routines, group learning, noisy, busy visual environments, and multitasking. Many children with autism will withdraw from or become overloaded by their learning activities and social situations due to their sensory sensitivities. For some children, the sensory environment can have a roll-on effect on them over the course of the school day, often resulting in afternoon or after-school meltdowns. Some sensory-seeking behaviour can lead to problems establishing and maintaining social relationships. And I gave some examples earlier of the child who smells their classmates' hair. So people supporting individuals need to note whether they are bothered by particular smells, sights, noises, or movements. Most often, fairly simple accommodations are sufficient for modifying the environment so that the sensory issues do not interfere with learning. For example, someone who is hypersensitive to sound might need to use headphones. For someone that's hypersensitive to light, they may need to wear a hat inside or wear sunglasses. For someone that has low or hyposensitive proprioception, they may need some movement breaks or to sit on an air cushion that provides them movement during the day. So rarely do individuals inform adults that sensory stimuli is offensive, but will rather express their discomfort through behaviours such as withdrawing and acting out. It's our roles as family members and as school staff to support and shape better ways for them to cope during these times so they can engage in daily activities with minimal stress. So on the screen now, it's a bit blurry, is some strategies to look at if a child is hypersensitive, so oversensitive. So for proprioception, you might provide some slow rocking movement to reduce muscle tension. You also might allow breaks from movement activities. For vestibular, you might allow the child to sit in a preferred seat. You might get them to avoid elevators and lifts and never force them on playground equipment, but provide encouragement. Some strategies for touch might be, when touch is necessary, be firm. Allow the child to wear gloves or to choose their own clothing. Cut off tags. Celebrate being messy. For taste, you might slowly introduce new foods. Provide safe foods in times where stress levels might be a bit higher, like excursions or birthday parties. You might allow the child to choose their own toothpaste or buy a toothpaste that has no smell or no taste. So with smell, it might be to avoid perfume or allow the child to eat away from others, or allowing the child to use the staff toilets instead of the main toilets. Could be quite smelly or noisy. And with noise, you might provide a quiet place for the child to work or play, or you might prepare the child for entering loud environments. You might teach the child to hum to block out noise, to wear earplugs or headphones. So for vision, it could be modifying light, or as I said before, allowing the child to wear sunglasses or a hat inside. It might be presenting materials in a visually organised way. So they're just a few examples, and you might want to add some of those examples to your matrix if you have it in front of you, or if you're going to look at a matrix a bit later. And then got some examples if the child is hyposensitive, so that's undersensitive to sensory stimuli. Most of these strategies are very simple environmental changes that are quite small but can make a world of difference to a child that has difficulties with their sensory processing. So some examples for proprioception could be to provide fidget toys, allow the child to sit on a chair instead of the floor. For vestibular, it could be to give access to movement when seated, use an air cushion, or provide opportunities throughout the day for them to seek movement. For touch, it could be to provide structured touch experiences to develop a library of knowledge about how things feel, to provide a fidget toy or other textured items in their pocket or on their desk. For taste, it might be to make sure non-food items are out of reach or allow access to food regularly. For smell, it might be to use smelly textures and pencils, provide opportunities for smell during the day. For hearing, you might need to use visual supports to support listening. Make sure you get the child's attention before talking, so make sure you say their name and they can see you before you actually start talking to them. For vision, it could be to make sure information is displayed longer. You use high contrast on worksheets, and both this slide and the one previously can be accessed through the professional development manuals, which can be accessed via the learning portal on our website. And you may have some other strategies that you use at home that you find effective or use in the classroom, and it's important to any strategies that you find useful to if you're a family to inform the schools, if you're a school to inform families. And you may still have some questions around sensory processing. And if you do, then the Facebook page might be something you want to use to ask questions or to ask an occupational therapist. And just before we finish, get you to reflect on what you have learnt today and where you want to go from here. Is there one thing you want to try? If you do want more information, then our website is all evidence-based and has a lot of information, including fact sheets and videos. There's also, if you register, you see that in the top right-hand corner of our website homepage, there's a button that says register. If you complete that form, you'll have access to our free online learning portal, which contains a lot of information modules that you complete in your own time, and also has access to those manuals. So if you want to access a professional development manual to get a copy of those strategy slides. We also have Facebook, which contains lots of tips and information and chats regarding on how best to support children with autism. We encourage people to leave comments and photos and links, etc. on the Facebook page, but any posts that are offensive or inappropriate will be removed. We also have Twitter. I just want to thank you all for joining the webinar today, and I hope that you got at least one thing out of it that you can try. Thank you.